Sharma, founder and CEO of Eppo. Welcome to the Data Exchange podcast.
Thank you, Ben. Happy to be here.
And so this conversation will center around experimentation culture, experimentation platforms. But Che, for people who are not living and breathing experiments on a day-to-day basis, so let's start out with the basics. So give us some examples of experiments that people do that warrants tooling.
Yeah, absolutely. So when you're working at a technology company, you're shipping products all the time. And you typically ship products thinking that it's going to improve the user experience. Now, experiments are really a way of sort of validating that you're actually improving the user experience. So what might be an experiment you would run? Well, it could be things like, what if we show 9 items on the page instead of 6 items on the page? It could be, what if we introduce this new modal that gives more information or background? Or it could be a new machine learning model. What if we tried this different way of returning search results versus this other way? It kind of spans the gamut of pretty much most product development. And you'll actually see this in the most mature companies, that every single product launch will become an experiment.
And actually, so I was going to go there next. So based on your description there, it seems like that when you get to the point where this is kind of a matter of routine and embedded in the culture, then almost every meeting you go to, when people express opinions, they have some data to back it up. So what are some of the companies that you look up to when it comes to experimentation?
Yeah, I mean, obviously Airbnb, where I spent most of my time, I think has gotten extremely good at experimentation. Booking.com, another kind of travel booking site, has, done quite a lot and helped build the brand of experimentation. And then Microsoft, they really pioneered a lot of great experimentation techniques back in the day. They churned out a lot of papers and a lot of capabilities that have since been, become much more mainstream. So, those are the names that come top of mind. But, Netflix, Uber, you kind of see basically every company, they get to a certain size and they can't really afford to not become experts at experimentation anymore. There are just so many people using the system that you just need a certain amount of oversight to kind of make sure that the product stays high quality.
So is this something that only sophisticated online companies should worry about, or when should a company start thinking more formally about experiments and an experimentation platform?
Pretty much the point at which you should start thinking about experimentation is when you are able to run an experiment. The ROI is so clear for these things that, if you can feasibly do it, then you should. Now, what makes it possible to run an experiment? There's one is you need enough sample size to do so. So you typically see experimentation emerge earlier for consumer companies and prosumer companies that have self-serve motions. They have higher traffic volumes in comparison to something fully B2B sales-led. And then the other input you need is you need infrastructure. If you can run an experiment with a very manual approach, you can literally have something that like you can just take some crude heuristic way of randomizing people and then manually calculate everything. But it's very hard to do many experiments that way. And so you need infrastructure to support you to actually get the sort of ROI you'd want.
So why should people be running experiments?
Yeah. So, the key thing is with experiments is to know, like, when are you helping and when are you hurting, right? We've seen a number of papers that have basically acknowledged this one point, which is no matter where you are, once you start measuring things, you realize of the 100 experiments you were running that you thought were going to improve things, probably 30% of them actually improved things. And another 30% made it actively worse. So once your kind of eyes are peeled back and you start to see these outcomes, it becomes crucially important to know which one is happening and to know it comprehensively across the org. But, the reason I started an experimentation company is, on top of that kind of tangible ROI, there's so many amazing second order effects that happen from establishing an experimentation program. So one of the ones that I felt over and over with every company is before you run experiments, if you're a data team, you primarily are living in the world of reporting, maybe an ML model here and there, but primarily reporting. And the problem with reporting is it doesn't tend to influence product decision-making very much. I mean, take an example where, you have some top line revenue dashboard. You are saying, here's how much money we're making every year. That's great for the CFO and for the board. They can look at these numbers. But if you're a product manager, you stare at that dashboard and you wonder, like, I don't really know what to do with that. I hope it goes up. Like, I hope revenue increases, but like from my product, I don't really see what I do differently. But once you start running experiments, suddenly you have every product team has a really intimate connection with metrics, which is a major goal for every data team, is to kind of build this muscle of kind of leveraging metrics in decision making. And you kind of start to change this, where instead of kind of chasing after decision makers to get them to listen to data, suddenly they come to you and they want to understand every input to a metric, all the leading indicators, what the data quality underneath it. There's this amazing intimacy that builds with metrics. But the thing that gets me most excited about experimentation, the reason I started a company around it, is that once you nail fluid, seamless end-to-end experimentation workflows, it creates this entrepreneurial culture where suddenly people can take risks. They can try things out and see if customers like it or not. And so, it's this amazing culture that once you've been at a place like an Airbnb or a Netflix, you really start to appreciate that you can have bottoms up product development. You can have these kind of feature launches that came from the mind of an isolated product team and then are able to be validated in the same way as the kind of head of products, project will be validated. And we saw so many results at Airbnb from things that seem like small changes that had outsized results.
And there's really no product manager or even executive that will say this is a bad idea, really. I mean, this empowers basically your company.
Yeah, I mean, there should probably be some guardrails, to make sure you're not doing something that is like clearly bad. But you can be very permissive here, right? Like, you can say, like, there's a reasonable case why this may or may not be better, and we're just going to run an experiment and validate it. The story I always like to tell here is that, I was at Airbnb for 5 years. I was the fourth data scientist, joined in 2012, stayed there till 2017. In that time, by far and away, the most valuable experiment we ever ran was this one where an engineer saw this pattern on the internet and she implemented it, where you click on an Airbnb listing and it opens it in a new tab. That one little change, small little change, boosted bookings by like 2 or 3%, like by this number that was like much higher than some, much more complicated experiments. And it all makes sense when you look at it post hoc, right? It's like, yeah, you don't want to lose your context. You open a new tab. A lot of people do this anyway. But, it's exactly the sort of project that, like, the design team might have rejected it because it was sort of clunky, and then there would have been no way for it to prove its worth without experimentation.
So, which brings me to the question of, so what are the key components, parts, and features of what you would consider a modern experimentation platform?
Yeah, so I think there are a good starting place for this is to say, what are you going to be doing when you run experiments? And for this, I like to think a lot about the way Reforge teaches experimentation. Reforge is this kind of emergent platform for training product teams. And they have this saying that when you start running experiments, first, you need to learn to run an experiment. You need to learn to test at all. So just being able to execute an experiment. Second, you need to learn how to learn. on each experiment, how can you understand what's going on? You know,
So
what
stop right there. So the first two things you named, do I need a data scientist or someone with an MBA who's a bit analytical? Will that be enough?
well, I will be pretty honest that in today's world, and we're trying to change this, you probably do want a data scientist to run an experiment because, to run an experiment, you have to get a lot of pieces to align. So yeah, we can get into the specific pieces here, but to run an experiment, you need these pieces. You need some way to randomize users and to deliver experiences to some randomly drawn allocation. So half the people are going to see this new flow, half the people are going to see the old flow. That's one starting point. The other is you need some way of modeling metrics. So the whole point of an experiment is you're going to see if you're going to increase or decrease this metric. So you need to have that modeled. And as most people in the data world will tell you, that's can be more complicated than it seems. So you need some way to kind of have metrics modeled, have a library of them. Then you need a bunch of data pipelines to calculate a few quantities. So first, you have to calculate the metrics for both sides of the experiment. Second, you need to run statistical tests to figure out when you see some effect, is it a real effect or is it just random chance? Third, you need to run a bunch of diagnostics because the worst thing is if you run some experiments and you're about to make some very serious decision around whether to continue investing in this area, whether to build up this team and have them continue going this direction, and to have that judgment be based on noise or an accident or something that is unrelated to product. So you need a bunch of diagnostics to check, did you actually randomize properly when you intended to randomize? Is this result due to a successful product or due to a bug, an engineering bug,
or an external event or confounding factor, right? So.
Yeah, I mean that's the other thing. There can be novelty effects. If you just had any new experience always tends to have a certain pattern, or maybe you're running your experiment during New Year's, and New Year's is always like a bit of a weird time.
Or the part of the country, the internet went down, right? So.
There we go. Yep, there can be a lot of macro effects that can really affect things. So you kind of need experiments to go through a bit of a health check, is the way we think about it. Usually when you want to run this experiment, first make sure none of these other things.
There's a workflow checklist that you have to go through.
Exactly. And so those are the kind of data computations you do. In addition, you'll want an ability to do investigations, and there's a long tail of those, slicing results by one thing, creating funnels to extract all the knowledge you want. And then the last piece, and I think people can sort of trivialize this, but it's reporting. The one thing about experimentation in comparison to most other parts of the data stack is that it's very public, it's very cross-functional, it's very collaborative. Product managers, engineers, designers, everyone is going to be, part of running this experiment and part of understanding the results. So, they all want to know what's going on. They want to understand, what has this team learned from this project, and then also understand the history of like, what have we run? What has been successful? What should we not try running again? So the reporting side of experimentation ends up being, a pretty big deal.
So then there's it sounds like, Jay, that there's like a once the company starts really getting serious about this, you almost have to have like a formal tool like Eppo, where I'm Ben. I propose this experiment. This is what I'm thinking of, and maybe someone at that point starts giving me feedback.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah.
There might be a more formal workflow so people know what's going on inside the company, right?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, and this is the maturity curve you see play out in every company, that you start off and there's a bunch of steps you have to do, right? You have to collaborate on the design of the experiment. You have to calculate how long you need to run it and measure the results and report on it. Early on, companies get started with a pretty fragmented approach to all of them, which is fine. You're dipping your toe in the water. And the general maturity curve is eventually you centralize all of those things. You get to a point where there's a vetted way to use metrics, there's a vetted way to randomize, and there's a kind of understood way to report on this. And so if you look at Airbnb or Uber or Facebook or whatever, you see these full-on end-to-end workflow applications, which allows them to kind of run experiments scalably, and kind of allow everyone to kind of to have a strategy that's centrally sitting on top of experimentation.
There's another area in data science, specifically ML, where you now have these tools for ML ops. And one of the tools that strikes me as somewhat related to what we're talking about is these tools for experiment tracking and management, right? So ML flow, Comet, weights and biases, where people can see what other people are doing as well. Besides keeping track of what they're doing themselves and being able to reproduce what they did 2 months later, their colleagues can see what they're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. The organization-wide visibility side of things is something we think about all the time, because once you're running even like 10 experiments at a time, you don't have to go full on Facebook level to even reach this point. You're going to have situations where, your experiment might interact with another experiment on the other side of the building. And so, not like what you, at the starting point, what you need to do is just have a central clearinghouse where you can be aware that these experiments are even happening at all. Because there can be like really interesting connections. I remember at Airbnb, we were focused on developing some of these features, Instant Book being one here, that, was a big strategic goal of the company. We wanted more of the company to be able to book instantaneously instead of having to ask for permission and be granted permission and have this back and forth. And so there was a team that was completely committed to that. Simultaneously, on the other side of the building, there was a team that was focused on getting people to sign up more often. At Airbnb, even today, you can go pretty much all the way to checkout without ever creating a user account. And they were exploring the idea of getting users further upstream to sign up. It turns out there was a huge connection between these two teams because the ability to instant book is connected to being logged in. So it's this thing that you might not have considered, but only once you saw that, oh, wow, the instant book rate goes way up for the people in this experiment, the sign-up experiments, then suddenly you learn some interesting connections. But without a central clearinghouse to see, here's how other experiments are affecting my metrics, it can be very hard. And so there's just so much learning that an organization gets once you have organization-wide visibility on what's happening.
By the way, Jay, so one of the functions of an experiment platform, because when you threw out the number 10 experiments, it seems slow, but it's actually quite high when they're happening simultaneously, right? So, because the thing I started thinking about, I started freaking out because I was looking over, I saw my book on experimental design, all these complicated factorial designs, right? So I hope the experiment platform will take care that all of those are accounted for somehow. If multiple teams are doing things simultaneously.
There are multiple philosophies on this. At Airbnb, we just kind of let everything fly all the time and tried to sort it out afterwards. And then there are other tools that are very careful about making sure there's only one experience, say, on a given page. I think that from my standpoint, and this is kind of a consistent theme across experimentation, I think the main thing is your choice on this matter should be intentional, right? You should, if you only want like one experiment at a time, then you should be able to guarantee that. If you are going to embrace a world where there are many experiments that anyone's experiencing at a given time, then you also need to know all of those experiments that might be happening and have some way of saying like, maybe even having an alert that says these two experiments are colliding in ways that are anomalous.
Yeah. So let's start talking about your company, Eppo. Um, so I think in our previous conversations, you mentioned that part of the reason you started Eppo was the timing is kind of right with the rise of these
Mm-hmm.
modern data stacks. So can you elaborate for our audience what you mean by this?
Yeah, definitely. You know, I think the whole data world has been kind of coming to grips with this sudden change where, historically, the companies that were running large experimentation programs were rolling their own data infrastructure. You saw a lot of people using, Hadoop clusters. When I was at Airbnb, I started out and we were running Pig and Hive, and we eventually kind of consolidated on Hive. And there was this kind of it was there was this kind of long tail of data infrastructure situations that existed across companies. But there's been this huge consolidation now where suddenly pretty much any company that is starting out now or is any in the growth stages, they will have some combination of Snowflake, Redshift, BigQuery, Databricks, as their kind of central data warehouse computation layer, and then a transformation layer, which is typically dbt or Airflow. And that, there's a lot of, to me, that is the modern data stack, is that you have this kind of center of the universe where a data lake that absorbs everything and a transformation model that creates these, tables that can then be interfaced to the rest of the business. And that has a lot of ramifications. For one, it means that companies can get started with use cases like experimentation much earlier because you can scale out some pretty great data capabilities, with a lean team in the modern data stack. I at Webflow, I was one of 3 data scientists, running an experimentation program, reporting program, a number of things. And you start to see that pattern in a lot of places. And so that's pretty cool, in that suddenly there's a lot more data teams and they have a lot more in common, because that means that you can start to see this burgeoning ecosystem of data applications such as Eppo. It also makes for an interesting situation because, if you're a Series B or Series C company, then it almost becomes, again, a mandate to start running experiments because that's what, is happening across the competitive landscape. You see pretty much every company right around Series B start to think through their experimentation program. And rightfully so. I mean, for me, going through this journey now a few times, I'm always struck by how experimentation, it starts out as this thing that solves this very particular problem, which is you want to launch products and know what worked and what didn't. And it's
but also isn't it one of these things where in many ways it's almost like how you convince a CEO or an executive, right? I mean, it's almost required. Like if an executive has an opinion, the way you push back on the executive is to say, "Well, we actually ran the numbers," and
yeah, but it can be. There's always this transition that happens, right? Because when you're first starting a company and you're a startup, you don't tend to be running A/B experiments in the way you might think about it because the sample sizes aren't there. You kind of like ship things and look for very explosive results. And there's kind of this change that happens in companies when you go from a startup to a kind of growth stage company. The best analogy I'd heard about this is, when you're a startup, like it's kind of like you are like, there's an analogy to flying a plane. When you're a startup, you're kind of like the Wright brothers plane, like a biplane thing where you can just kind of like turn your head around and see the entire landscape and see everything. You have perfect visibility. Over time, that Wright brothers plane becomes a 747. Suddenly you're driving a big jet airplane and you are primarily piloting via like a bunch of dials and knobs and stuff like that. And that requires a fundamentally different governance model. Suddenly you're not talking to like 3 users to figure out, what's good and what's bad. You have to actually look at your metrics to get a picture of your users. And so right around that time is when experimentation starts to really loom large as the best way to understand what products are good or bad, once you are driving with dials and knobs.
So speaking of which, you're a startup, right?
Yeah.
So you have to start building your product from the ground up. So what did you choose to focus on and prioritize in terms of building this modern experimentation platform?
Yeah, absolutely. So for us, I think there were two primary goals that we have. One is we really want to quickly enable people to get the benefits of experimentation. And, to get the benefits of experimentation, you need to, first make sure you're running experiments properly, right? Again, the diagnostic side, the investigation side, every time the best way of explaining this is, whenever you're running an experiment, you think you're testing one thing, which is just your product idea. Is it a good idea to remove friction or to do whatever? But in actuality, you're actually testing three things. You're testing your product idea. You're testing your execution of the product idea. Did you build it bug-free? Did you build it with good design? And you're also testing your infrastructure, your experimentation infrastructure. Are you randomizing properly? Are you handling outliers correctly? And so we wanted to build a system primarily that simplified the world so you're only measuring one thing, which is your product idea. So via a series of automations and alerting and just kind of advanced stats, we're able to get companies so that they can always be aware when an experiment is teaching you about product. So that's the first principle underlying what we're trying to do is, letting you actually reliably be able to run good knowledge generating experiments without requiring a stats PhD to be personally involved every time. The second thing that was a major tenet of ours is we're building our system to be modular, to be flexible, in that people have all of their data in Snowflake, BigQuery, Redshift, Databricks. We want to meet the data there. We do not want to create a separate source of truth warehouse that we own that's black box. We are trying to seamlessly fit into the broader vision that data platform leads have, which is, with the modern data stack at the center of the universe. Similarly, we are going to offer our own feature flagging solution, but we are happy to work alongside whatever feature flagging solution you have. So, if you have this internal tool that you've built, if you're working with Optimizely or something like that, we are happy to coexist with those tools and just use those for randomization, and we will deliver all of the kind of diagnostics, advanced stats, analytics, reporting. So those are kind of the two primary tenets. Is one, help people quickly get to a point where they're generating knowledge and validating hypotheses. And two, flexibly fit into the broader technical vision that these companies have.
So the first tenet, when you say as frictionless as possible, so this is basically through a GUI. So it's almost like a no-code experimentation platform, right? You don't have to write any code. So how much guidance do you provide? Like in terms of if I set up an experiment, do you tell me, hey, you're not running this experiment long enough, or there's not a big enough sample?
Yeah, we have this kind of one central paradigm for how our tool works, which is that within a company, there tend to be a few people who have run a lot of experiments, who have a real vision for how things are, or they're data workers and they just know where the metrics are. We let these people code in the kind of practices that they want. For example, every time you track revenue, you're going to track it with this table. That's a very basic principle. Another could be every time you run an experiment in general, you are always going to track customer support tickets or something like that, so that every team is aware if they are impacting this metric. So you can set up some broad principles that every team will use. And then all of the other product teams, and we think of product managers as probably the main persona here, although engineers and designers are also part of this. They then can operate within those guidelines. They start an experiment, they have these what we call guardrail metrics, the customer support tickets or revenue, whatever. And then we offer a way where they can craft their primary metrics, but use the right tables accordingly. So the interfaces are really around kind of giving the appropriate choices to the people who are kind of best in position to make those choices.
So do you think that at some point, let's say I use Eppo and I've been using it for 6 to 12 months, at that point, you might have learned enough about the data in my company and the experiments that were previously run that you could provide guidance to me as I'm setting up my experiment, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that is the direction we're going to be going down very soon and have already started making moves there. So the most basic thing we can help you with is there's a concept called power analysis, which is how long to run the experiments. And this is a very big deal for many companies, especially when you first get started.
This is where a lot of mistakes happen.
A lot of mistakes. I have so many stories. I remember like not running experiments for the correct amount of time is like probably the most like insidious problem in experimentation, where when I first arrived at Webflow, I arrived and there was this product that I thought was really well built. I was pretty impressed with how the team did their research, how their team crafted an MVP thing, and it was all like really cool. And then I arrived and they had just finished up an experiment, and everyone was disappointed because it didn't show any metric lifts, and you could sort of feel this deflating feeling among the org. But I then looked at the experiment and it was pretty clear they did not run it long enough. It was, if you just do the simple power analysis thing, it needed to be run for like 3 months and they ran it for 1 week. So it seems like this small thing, running the experiment long enough, but because of that, there's no longer a team working on that product. That product hasn't been touched because the org sort of learned that it was not a good investment. But in actuality, they just didn't run an experiment properly. So, running an experiment for long enough is, a kind of chronic issue. And it's really tough because when you're at small sample sizes, it can be a struggle. To use certain metrics might take 6 months. And so it becomes instead a bit of a negotiation. What can you do to lower the experiment duration? And, this is a whole topic.
Jay, how do you prevent the decision maker from peeking into the results early in the process?
Yeah. That's the other side of this. That's very insidious. Yeah. I think in general, experimentation, it has this central paradox, which is that if you use the legacy statistical approaches that were kind of originally designed for, lab rats in papers, you're supposed to only look at a very small number of things and only look at them once. Now, anyone who has worked in any tech organization knows that when you run experiments, everyone wants to look at everything all the time. They want to cut it by a million things. They want to check every day. It becomes this situation you have to manage. And I think of Eppo as a tool that is trying to kind of help organizations run experiments more than just an individual. And so this sort of problem is very top of mind for us. So, the short answer of how we do this is one, we have progress bars that show you like how close to done is this thing. So like that sort of context of, is this experiment ready to read, is central to our tool. And I don't really see that in, most in-house tools, but this is very ingredient. Yeah. And then the other side is, we try to we're not prescriptive here, but we do have an opinion that most companies should not really be running these legacy advanced stats methods, the t-test, the z-tests, because of this reason that they are readily kind of, people cheat with them and peak all the time. For us, like there's a whole realm of analysis called sequential analysis, which just embraces the idea that you're going to look at it every day. And, we're building that into our system so that if you decide to use this paradigm and the test goes green, within some guidelines, maybe you want a minimum of 7 days or, 14 days for an experiment to run. But if that's true and it turns green and you see a positive lift, you actually can call it and not be p-hacking. So that's one of the great things about these tools. And we have one of the authors of this sequential analysis method that they use it optimizedly. He was the kind of first statistician there, and he's helping us as well. We're implementing a lot of those. The other way you can do it is, Bayesian methods are also significantly better than t-tests and z-tests in this regard, although not perfect. But the great thing about Bayesian methods is that if you're trying to say, look, I'm not going to wait 6 months, I'm just going to wait 2 months and make a decision, or I'm just going to wait 2 weeks and make a decision, they're kind of built for that. They're basically saying, like, you're going to make a decision under uncertainty. Here's a tool that will help you do that.
But to be clear, even though you're describing these things in really kind of statistical terms, the end user is a product manager, and the UX will display it in a way that the product manager can run with, right?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, this is, again, with our interfaces, we want to present the people with the information and choices that they are kind of best equipped to do. And so part of that is under the hood using appropriate stats methods and displaying, the right UI to say when something is done, when it's winning, et cetera. Like in general, we want to abstract away a lot of these advanced stats methods so that the PM reading it doesn't have to know that a sequential analysis is happening or whatever. They don't have to be super aware of that. And this is especially important. There's one of the things that I think most experiment practitioners don't realize. There's a wealth of advanced statistical methods which have been mainlined into the tooling at a place like Airbnb or Facebook, which doesn't really exist at your kind of growth stage company. There's a whole world of techniques around variance reduction, which, perhaps is because we call it variance reduction, which is not informative at all to a layperson. But what it means is that your 3-month experiment might take 2 months, which is a huge amount of savings in product time. But, to implement them starts to look a little bit like a machine learning problem. It definitely is something that is beyond the means of your kind of 10, 20 person data team. But we will be mainlining into our system.
So how much of what we've discussed so far is available today at Eppo?
Today at Eppo, you can use your feature flagging service and configure metrics with us, and we will automate all of the data computations you have to do. So we will calculate your metrics. We will run appropriate stats tools on them. We will alert you when there's issues with randomization, when there's an issue with data quality, when there's an issue with metrics suddenly dropping, like an experiment that's going terribly, but no one's looking at it. And really importantly, we basically have a full-on BI tool that's part of Eppo. Because one of the things you realize when you look at any of these tools at Airbnb and Netflix is that the experiment, they never end. You never just run them and look at a result and move on. Almost always, the product teams want to understand a little bit more. Okay, this experiment didn't work. Was it because of a drop off in the funnel? Did it work really well for some use cases and not others? Was there a bug on Android or something? Did people even see the new feature? Like, there becomes this huge set of questions that just turn into like analytics, bandwidth expense. Suddenly 2 weeks are being spent in a Jupyter notebook trying to untangle all this stuff. And so we basically have a kind of rich experiment-centric BI tool where you can answer all those things. A PM can answer all those things, without having to reach out to an analyst. And then the last piece is we have spent enormous amount of resources in design. I think so much of data tools and collaboration tools in general are held back by a lack of design. It's one thing for, a data scientist statistician to read a Looker dashboard and like see p values and confidence bounds and a bunch of things. But we have invested to make sure the junior PM, recently out of college, can look at an experiment result and like get the same takeaway that the statistician will, or that the CEO who's casually browsing through experiments can look at these things and not get incredibly worried because some metric down the page is bright red and tanking. That they have a clean reporting interface of like the things that the CEO needs to know.
So, and also, as you mentioned, the starting point, as long as I have one of these modern data stacks and the company has kind of coalesced around this modern data stack, I'm pretty much ready to go, right? So all I have to do is designate these metrics, right?
Yep, completely. That's the great thing about, the new modern data ecosystem. If you are a Snowflake, Redshift, BigQuery, Databricks user, and you use dbt and Airflow, then you have all you need to engage with us and kind of many other data applications. So you can scale like very sophisticated data practices without having to, hire a team the size of Airbnb's.
Right. And so what's on the roadmap in the next 6 to 12 months?
Yeah, right now we're very heads down deploying to our, first set our customers, and just building out kind of more of these automations, more of these health checks. I think in the, next set of months, there's two directions we're going to be investing in. So one is building out the full end-to-end workflow. We will forever be modular and flexible to feature flagging tools and to various data warehouses. But we will likely be developing our own feature flagging tool, and so it'll allow multi-armed bandits and some of these more sophisticated use cases which require kind of an integrated system. And then the other is we're going to be investing a lot in what I would call kind of auto analytics. So for example, today, if you're trying to understand an experiment result, you have some PM go and slice dice things all over the place, right? It's like check it by persona, by device, whatever. There's a lot of that we could probably do for you, to try to give you some quick synopsis of.
So in other words, my KPI is this metric. You will slice and dice and try to find the drivers.
Exactly. Just a quick one-click report. And it'll take some calibration to make sure it's a stable result. But that's an area we see ourselves developing quite a lot in.
So looking ahead, so let's imagine a world where more people are running experiments, experimentation platforms like yours get adopted. So one of the things that I don't know if the experimentation world is thinking of, in ML, you've got all these people now focus on responsible AI, right? Which is an umbrella term for managing risks like security, privacy, transparency, safety and reliability, so on and so forth, fairness. So is there a responsible experiment community, or because wasn't there a famous thing around Facebook getting caught running experiments? I forget the ethical.
Facebook has taken experimentation culture pretty far, and I can be pretty clear that I'm not as well read in all the things Facebook has experimented on. I know there's been a lot of flack there, but
so what is the notion of responsible experiments?
Yeah, right. I mean, it's a tough question. I think about this a lot. Is that experimentation essentially turns product development into like a greedy algorithm that chases your metric, right? And so it blesses things that kind of improve your metric, and it fails things that decrease your metric.
Yeah, I guess it could be around it could be around like a certain group of people, demographic group of people are being shown something, like, or getting gouged on prices, whereas this kind of thing, right?
Yeah, and so my short answer today, and it's something that I want to keep talking to responsible parties to figure out what the best situation is that a starting point is to just bring all of this out of into some place that's visible centrally.
Sunlight.
Sunlight, exactly. So like, everyone at the company can kind of see the types of experiments going on. And then the other side of it is, a lot can happen sort of out of ignorance more than malice, right? Like a lot of stuff happens because, look, this system just told me that this is a good experiment, and so I'm going to launch it.
I like that ignorance, because basically it's mostly because I didn't check for it, not because I intended to harm you, right?
Yeah. So the way I think of, at the core, what Eppo is doing is it's taking the kind of opinions and philosophies of a core set of specialized people and helping them scale it out to the rest of the org. So, things like you're always going to track these metrics, you're always going to run it for this amount of time, you're going to have these, you're always going to write a hypothesis, just a lot of the basic principles that experiment leaders have. I think a big part of that as well is that these experiment leaders should think through the metrics of bad behavior. Like what are examples of things that like we definitely don't want more or less of this. At Airbnb, we went through this situation where it became clear, and this is part of the reason for Instant Book, but it became clear in the paradigm where people would ask hosts to whether they could stay or not, there was a lot of room for kind of discriminatory behavior. And so we saw like pretty big differences in outcomes between your race and whether you got accepted to, stay at Airbnb. That's the sort of thing that once you get that metric, you can put that into your experimentation platform. Like you can actually see if you are, increasing or decreasing that effect. And so I think, what my hope is that most companies, once you're aware that a bad behavior might be happening, that you actually encode this into the core philosophies of an experimentation company, of experimentation culture.
Is there a need for transparency? Transparency in the ML sense is how does the model kind of work, or how is the model making decisions, right? So in the experiment world, I guess, am I subject to an experiment? You kind of just assume that now, right? So all these websites are running experiments right and left. But so is there a need for more transparency?
I would have to think about that. I think part of the thing with experimentation is that the maturity curve of these companies, by the time you get big enough, and literally every product change is an experiment, right? So like, do you need to be aware that someone fixed these bugs and
right.
kind of changed
It's
around?
too much, right?
Yeah, it's just the word experiment, I think, can sometimes conjure like some like really kind of dark laboratory stuff when it's really just product changes is what experiments are. Yeah, so I don't have a real answer yet. I mean, there might be situations where users need to know what experiment they're in. By and large, I honestly don't think many users would even want that, but we'd have to see.
Yeah, and I wonder if and I don't see, actually there's no regulators that are calling for it, right? So it's not like data privacy. You had GDPR, CCPA, this kind of thing. In ML, I think there's more call for responsible AI and responsible ML. But in this area, it seems like you don't hear about regulators paying attention to it, right?
Right. Yeah. Because I think, when I think about it some more, like the real question is, what types of products should you be able to build? Because experimentation is just measuring two, sides of a product change, before and after. So the idea of measuring before and after is not itself, particularly a big deal. But what is the change you're considering? Is that something that is sincerely in users' best interests? Like, is that something that's in society's best interest? That's kind of a bigger debate, because you could do those things and you could not run an experiment. You could just put it out there. That's a. So I think there's probably a lot more need for oversight of that process.
Like you said, I mean, one of the things with sunlight is if you see something's happening, you can actually act in a more timely fashion, right? So actually, as you were talking, I was thinking, what in drug experiments, right? So when you have placebo and control, if the control group is starting to get harmed, some people shut it down. So maybe there's the equivalent of that in this world as well, right? So if a certain group of people seem to be getting disproportionately gouged on prices or whatever, then you shut down the experiment.
Completely. This is exactly the sort of situation where what our system will allow you to do is, like, suppose you in this company have a metric that your team just really cares about, and it could be out of strategic business reasons, or it could even be, like a moral reason or whatever. You can dictate that I want to see how every experiment affects this metric. So, this is important. Again, organization-wide visibility, bringing it out onto sunlight. which doesn't really exist in, many other systems. I mean, there's a number of people in the org, least of all the C-suite leaders, who are not going to be personally involved in every experiment. Like, they're just not. And so they just need a way to quickly go through and see what are all the things happening? How are they going? Who's running them? How much longer do they have? And then to even do that in history, one of the things that I was pretty proud at Airbnb is we built this knowledge base called the knowledge repo, which took a lot of our strategic analyses and kind of indexed them, kind of post-process them to be very digestible, and created this central repository of knowledge. And, I think that we will be building that sort of concept at Eppo, so that you can see, here are all the experiments that have been run, here's how they went, were they run long enough, or should we rerun them, be able to kind of look at that history. And I think experimentation is just a great place for building a knowledge base, because once you've run an experiment, it has this unique place in time where the design has already been baked. You made a decision on design. The engineering is already baked. You decided to build a certain way. You even measured it. You took all that time. So this is a really opportune time to document everything for posterity, and to say, like, here's why we did this thing. Here's what we did. Here's how it went. And our system, our hope is that sort of documentation just sort of happens naturally. It's not some post hoc process where you have to remember and go back and write it all up. We're going to be capturing a lot of the sort of history of running the experiment.
That's great. So to the extent that you're documenting things on yourself automatically, that's a great help. So in closing, experimentation platforms in 2 years or 5 years, are they going to be much more prevalent? Because I have to say, Jay, right now it still seems like somewhat a province of more advanced companies. Am I wrong?
I would say you're probably more correct than wrong, but it's changing quickly.
Okay.
Very, very quickly. If you think of it, becomes really a question of why not run experiments, right?
Right.
And primarily because, once you run experiments, you start to really quickly realize all of those things you were about to launch that seemed really promising, probably only a third of them actually improved things. And it's really, really important to know what third that was, because another third is probably actively making it worse, and you don't want to launch those. So you can't really afford to not run experiments once you are able to do so. But when are you able to do so? That's a question of sample size and infrastructure. The infrastructure piece is just steadily going to become turnkey like water. And so it'll just be a matter of all the companies who have the sample size to do so will be running experiments. And you kind of see this already in the technology world. I would anticipate, other industries as well to follow suit.
And this is also a lot of people are running experiments on mobile devices as well, right?
Yep, absolutely.
Mobile apps, right?
Absolutely.
And these days, there's a lot of mobile apps that have enough sample size to really be experimenting all the time, right?
Oh, I mean, Facebook is primarily mobile, right? So there's definitely plenty of mobile apps that are running a lot of experiments.
And so then does this mean that as experimentation becomes democratized, what's the role of the data scientist in the experimentation world?
Yeah, I think the paradigm we're embracing, which I think makes a lot of sense, is that, the data teams of the future, there are certain things that no application can really help you with. And that is to take data sources that were produced by kind of application transaction workflows, by the machinery of the application, like logs, transactional tables, et cetera, and translate them into reusable business components. This is what revenue is. This is what a sign up is. This is what a user is, et cetera. I think in the future, data teams, like this world of data modeling, is going to be primarily what they are focused on. Because once you've built out those reusable components, you're now going to have a wealth of tools that will let you do all the things you want to do, from lifetime value estimation, experimentation,
even no code ML.
No code ML, absolutely. I mean, the ML world is clearly headed towards a major infrastructure upgrade.
Mhm.
So, a lot of this stuff will become much more turnkey. So, I think that in the future, you're going to see teams be able to reach a point of data quality much more quickly because that'll be their kind of primary mandate. They'll be very focused on this data modeling world and then being able to plug in and play different systems to work with it.
By the way, here's an area where you can think about the whole responsible experimentation thing. Because we talked a lot about running experiments for websites or mobile apps, but we kind of when we talk, we always assume that it's a private company. But you've got a lot of government agencies and government websites that are massive scale too, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
They
And you
should be
start to
running
see,
experiments to provide better services for the population, right?
I know, and this is exactly an example of where adopting experimentation, like it's just becomes crucially necessary. Like I know a bunch of the folks in the government technology world, who are trying to who worked on things as trivial as seemingly trivial as like being able to log in to your Obamacare, platform. That was a really tough problem. That was like a whole organization got spun up to try to make it easy to log in to the Affordable Care Act plans. And this sort of like it's one of those things where even building basic product is incredibly aided by running experiments because you're just operating at a scale. Like you are not able to measure whether you're doing your job well or not unless you're able to experiment and see.
Yeah. And with that, thank you. And we look forward to maybe checking in a year or so to see if any of our predictions about how prevalent experimentation platforms will have played out.
Absolutely. Happy to have this conversation every few years and we'll see how our predictions go.
All right. Thank you.